Hello, I'm Sophia, and this is The World Unpacked. Just a few weeks ago, French President Emmanuel Macron took a big gamble. After the European Parliament elections revealed gains for the far-right party National Rally, Macron called a snap nationwide election 3 years earlier than required. Macron hoped to use this election to push back on the right-wing gains and restore power to the centre. But some worried that Macron had become overconfident, perhaps even arrogant. They feared that instead of clarifying France's support for the centre, Macron's snap election could end up handing over a parliamentary majority to the National Rally and deepen the right-wing capture of French politics. Now, after 2 rounds of voting, we have the results, but I'm not sure that we have clarity. While indeed in the first round of voting the far right dominated, this second round saw that a new electoral coalition of left-wing parties came in first, Macron's party second, and the far-right third. No party has a majority, and so the question is, what comes next? What do the election outcomes mean for Macron, for the future of French politics, for European leadership, and for NATO? Joining me today is my brilliant friend and colleague Tara Varma, who is a visiting fellow for the Center on the US and Europe at the Brookings Institution, and who was previously the head of the Paris office of the European Council on Foreign Relations. I can't imagine anyone better to have this discussion with. Tara, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Sophia.
Right, so let's jump straight in. Tara, did Macron's gamble pay off or did it backfire?
So I would say it could have backfired in a possibly worse manner than it ultimately did a few days ago, but I wouldn't really say it paid off. When Macron came into power in 2017, he came in without a party structure and managed basically to get 360 members of the National Assembly in an unprecedented scenario that really France had never seen before. Today, with the elections that were held on the second round of the elections that were held on July 7th, he ends up with only 160 members of parliament. So it is better than what was expected. People thought that his party could be totally wiped out. He's not wiped out, but it's a severe decrease from what he originally had, and also from his original motto, which was to be the bulwark against the far right in a durable and structural manner for France.
Let's look at the very near future first. So we have a hung parliament. No party has come out first. There's no majority. So I guess there are 2 options. We could have a minority government or we could have a coalition government. And we've heard from several commentators, including yourself, I think, in previous days, that France, of course, does not have a tradition, a history of coalition governments. So this could be indeed very difficult. So how difficult really is this going to be? What do you expect will happen in the days and weeks to come? Which party do you think will get the post of prime minister under Macron? Tell us what we need to expect.
Well, first, let me add a third option to the 2 that you've already laid out. So minority government, coalition government, but there is also a technical government that could be put in place if we're struggling still in the days to come to actually find an agreement. I think that's important. And my sense is Macron's favorite option, or least worst option, is probably that one, because then he can conduct current affairs with this new government until the end of the summer, and particularly so that the Olympic Games can happen in Paris in not so chaotic manner. So what we're seeing now, as you said, the left-wing coalition came in first. That was the least likely of scenarios. And I said so myself even a few days ago. I didn't think that this would happen. What we saw in the first round were really very, very high results for the far right. And a 1-week campaign between the 2 rounds where what was demonstrated was really not only the incompetency of a vast majority of far-right candidates, but actually their racism, their anti-Semitism, their xenophobia. This was laid out in a very striking manner. Originally, the Rassemblement National tried to say that these were, 1 or 2 black sheep, and actually several newspapers counted them, and they were 108 black sheep, 38 of which are now members of parliament in France. So I think we need to mention that. The sense was that Macron would have to go to the left wing to form a government, even though they don't have a majority. They did come in first. I think my own sense, and from what we've been observing, but this is a fast-moving situation, Macron would actually prefer to have a coalition with the right and the Républicains. They also do not have a majority per se to reach the 289 members of parliament that they need. But maybe they could do a minority government with the right. And I think he would prefer
And
to
sorry,
do that.
when you say right, you mean the conservatives rather than the far right?
Yes, absolutely. The Conservatives, Les Républicains, mainstream right-wing party, which was basically the party that governed France for most of the Fifth Republic and who are really marginal now. But they do have key political figures in there. Macron's former prime minister, Edouard Philippe, also the current interior minister, Gérald Darmanin, who is himself, I would say, quite close to the far right, at least has ideas that are similar. So I think his preference would go to that in order to avoid a coalition with the left.
I see. So it's interesting that you mentioned the fact that Macron might prefer a technical government. This is very much in line with his start in French politics, I would say. I remember him coming onto the scene with this idea that he would overcome politics, really, would overcome the left-right divide with expertise, with centrism, with effective governing, and the chaos of the left-right divide in France. My sense from what you've been telling me so far is that you would probably not give him full points on that score. I don't think we can say that he succeeded. So I do want to talk about what these elections mean for politics in France and for the different camps, at least the three main camps in this election. So let's start with maybe Macron's own party, which came in third in the first round and second in the second round, right? He, I think, ruffled some feathers with his decision to call these snap elections in his own party. So I'm interested in your assessment of how much support he still has. I know that Gabriel Attal, the prime minister under Macron, who resigned and then took back his resignation when the president asked him to stay in office after the elections, he sounded quite critical between the lines in his statements of Macron. And so tell me, how secure is Macron's leadership of his own party and where do they stand now?
It's really interesting that you bring up Attal because Attal is really a product of what was Macron's success until now. Someone who really supported him from the start, was the spokesperson for the government for a while. He became education minister, the youngest education minister in France, and now the youngest prime minister. And so he really trails into Macron's success. And he wasn't forewarned of the decision to dissolve the National Assembly, which, of course, had an immediate impact on his job, which he had been doing for only 6 months. And he was not also party to any of the politic hearing or thinking that Macron had behind this decision. And I think he took it quite personally, which I understand. He was already the prime minister of a government which had only a relative majority at the National Assembly. And what we saw in the speech that he gave on the evening of July 7th, when the second round happened and the results came in, was a very forceful speech in which he did not mention the president. And he did not mention Emmanuel Macron by name. He said that the dissolution was not his decision, but he decided that he would not suffer from it, and so that he would have a proactive way of campaigning. But I think there's a question of lisibility and visibility of what Macron's party is, and which we're really asking ourselves right now. Macron came in 2017 with a movement called En Marche. Then it transformed into La République En Marche. Then it transformed into Renaissance. And now the latest avatar of actually this coalition for the campaign was called Ensemble, Together. So I think just by this, in a way, this is symbolic, but I think it does say something about what Macronism was and is today. It's something that is hard to grasp. And it still centers very much around the figure of Macron. He has struggled to, if not name an heir, even actually get people to be Macron babies or, future Macron leaders. He struggles with that. And he has a very solitary way of governing, which we've seen with this decision to dissolve, where, as I said, he didn't forewarn his prime minister. He didn't forewarn the president of the National Assembly, the president of the Senate, which he is supposed to do by the Constitution. He spoke to them afterwards, but clearly his decision was made, and he made that very clear. So I think we're finding ourselves in a situation where the question now, basically the onus is on him to empower the new parliamentarians of his coalition and to see the extent to which he can extend goodwill and political will to form something that goes beyond him. And I think that's the key question right now.
Yeah, because of course there's a 2-term limit in French politics. If he wants to advance his movement to survive beyond him, then he needs to
So it's
appoint
2
successors.
consecutive terms. He could actually come back in 2032 if he wanted. Just putting this out there for listeners.
We see this all over the world and all over Western democracies, this phenomenon. Right, moving on to the left-wing coalition. Can we call it a coalition? It's more of an electoral deal, I guess, that they made. The Greens, the Socialists, the Communists, and La France Insoumise, the France Unbowed, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So this was a tactical coalition asking voters to support all of them together to stand up to the far right. Are they going to be able to agree on a common program? Will they have to?
So they published a manifesto very early on, basically a few days after the decision to dissolve. They produced the manifesto, and they had announced that the day after the dissolution that they were forming this coalition. And they struggled on a few foreign policy issues, which I think is really interesting. Continuing aid to Ukraine, Israel-Gaza, recognition of a Palestinian state, how to tackle EU affairs, trying to end any free trade agreement that would be pushed by the EU. And so these disagreements were so striking that they didn't manage to form a common list for the European Parliament. But I think there was a sense, coming back to the national context, that fighting against the far right and making sure the far right didn't win was the key priority here. And so they did manage to overcome these differences in their manifesto. And they managed to stay united until now, which I think is one of the key of the successes and the reason why they came in first. Again, something that honestly nobody had predicted. It's because we saw this unity. Of course, right now in politics, personnel is everything. There's a lot of infighting going on to see who would be the best placed candidate to become prime minister. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is extremely pugnacious and divisive. He's been known also to pronounce anti-Semitic comments. He really serves as a scarecrow for a lot of voters, left-wing, but also other voters. There are actually people on the left, Boris Vallaud from the Socialist Party, François Ruffin, who was formerly with La France Insoumise, who was brought up in Emmanuel Macron's city as well, and who's quite a prominent politician. Clémentine Autain, the same. We're seeing a series of politicians breaking with La France Insoumise because they really don't like their way of governing. And one of the key revelations for me of this campaign is Marine Tondelier, who's the head of the Greens and who has played an instrumental role between the two rounds in really keeping the glue together amongst themselves. So let's see what happens. My sense, as I said, is that Macron will do everything he can not to have to do a coalition with them, or if he has to, it would be a center-left to center-right coalition, of which La France Insoumise would be excluded. So let's see how these things go, and that would, of course, serve in dividing the left-wing coalition. So we're seeing a lot that is at play right now. And the big question, whether this coalition can stay together or whether it wants to be with Macron at some point to govern for the greater interest of the country.
Okay, so very much moving parts. What does all of this mean for the far right? And I'm particularly interested what it means, you think, for far right sentiment among voters. Do you think that this was a protest vote? Or do French voters connect with the issues brought forward by the far right? And of course, I think we still have to take this seriously. They came in third, but they increased their number of MPs. They're clearly a force to be reckoned with and to stay in French politics. So how do you see this develop?
Absolutely. I think they really are a force to be reckoned with. And for listeners to realize, in 2017, they had 8 members of parliament. They now have 143. So actually, 10 days ago, they had 89, and they managed to increase their numbers of members of parliament by almost 50% this time around. So I think we have to take them very seriously. One of the things that Marine Le Pen said on the evening of the second round was that the tide was rising and that she knew that her time would come. So I think she's very focused on 2027 and the presidential election. And what we've seen until now is a Rassemblement National who has, in a way, learned from its mistake. I think they've realized how scary the candidates that they presented were, and they're going to work basically to change that. Because with a larger group at the National Assembly comes also larger funds They'll have more money to train assistants, researchers, collaborators inside the National Assembly. I fear they're going to professionalize themselves even more because they have this key objective of the presidency in 3 years' time, and 3 years is actually quite a lot. And so I don't think they're disappearing. I think there is an underlying trend of populism. And what was interesting to me is that actually in between the two rounds and before that, the key campaign proposition they had was to ban dual citizens from attaining strategic positions inside the administration, evidently showing how racist they were and bringing everything back to identity politics. And they didn't tackle at all economic and social issues, which most people who vote for them actually vote for them for. And it was quite striking to me that they adopted this attitude, which basically evidently showed what their ideological roots were. This is a party that was founded in 1972 by people who supported the Waffen-SS and who were clearly neo-Nazi. So, this doesn't disappear. And there are a lot of people today who tell you, voters of the National Rally, who say that the party has changed its name, has changed its identity. It's not that party anymore. It's not Jean-Marie Le Pen, Marine Le Pen's father's party. It's the party of Jordan Bardella, this 28-year-old who also has been in politics his whole life, but seems to be a lot more relatable to them. And so I think we need to keep that in mind because it's not a protest vote anymore. What we saw is a very high level of turnout in these two rounds. And until this election, it used to be that a higher level of turnout meant fewer votes for the Rassemblement National. This time around, it was a higher level of turnout and higher vote share for them. So I think we're looking at something which is a vote of adhesion right now. But it also shows that there is something about identity politics and a form of acceptance of racist and anti-Semitic ideas being put out there in the public debate. We see this in France, but we see this in other European countries and in the US as well, and something that Democrats at large should be worried about because there needs to be an answer provided to this. And I think there have to be global solutions, but also very local solutions and local connections. What a lot of the Rassemblement National voters say is that they feel disconnected from Paris, they feel disconnected from the decision-making places, they feel not connected to their politicians and policymakers. And this is something that we can do something about and that social media cannot compensate or mitigate. It's really about having real human connections here.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think at the very least, what we are facing is a normalization of these positions in France and elsewhere. Okay, so we are going to take a short break now. And in the second half of the show, we're going to get into the implications of these elections for the standing of Macron, for European politics, and for NATO.
Hi, I'm Annalise Riles, professor of law at Northwestern University, anthropologist, and host of Everyday Ambassador, a new podcast that peels back the curtains of high-stakes diplomacy and gives everyone backstage access to the most powerful methods of leadership. On each episode, we'll break things down into deceptively simple moves that everyone can make to help build a more peaceful and sustainable world. So join me and become an everyday ambassador on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. Okay, we're back, and we now want to talk about the implications of the French elections. And I want to start with the implications for Macron himself. And there's a reason that I want to start with him. I think what we've seen in French politics, and Tara, you and I have discussed this before, is a hyper-personalization, a real focus on the president, which makes sense in some ways because of the presidential system that awards him a lot of power, particularly over foreign affairs. It also aligns with his style of politics that you've outlined in the first half of the show that really is not, let's say, a team player style of politics. Now, after the first round of elections, there was a lot of speculation and concern over a lame duck French president and what that would mean for European politics, particularly worrying before the background that France has in recent years been, if not a leader, because for leadership you need followers, but at least an agenda setter on European politics. So there was a lot of concern that Macron would be basically out for the next couple of years until the next elections. I don't think we are quite there yet, but is he weakened, would you say, on the international stage?
I think he was definitely weakened between the decision to dissolve the National Assembly and the results of the second round, because there was a sense, first of all, that nobody understood what this decision was, that it was taken really in a rash manner. It accentuated the impression of his solitary manner of governing, but also a sense that it was a reckless decision with very little thinking of consequences, of course, for the French population, but also European partners and the American ally with the NATO summit happening. So a sense that there was a bit of a misunderstanding there. And the second reason for preoccupation was that the National Rally could have come to power, and then we would have found ourselves in really a bicephalic situation where there would have been two heads of French foreign policy, the president, but also the prime minister. One of the things that the National Rally was quite clear about is that they have a view on European policy, they have a view on whom the French nominee for commissioner should be, they have a view on NATO, they have a view on Russia. They wanted this view to be heard. They have a few people around them who know foreign policy and who have a vastly divergent view from Macron's. And what we've seen in previous cohabitations, when the president and the prime minister are from two different parties, they were from the mainstream left and the mainstream right, and they had some disagreements, but they, in a way, managed to overcome them fairly easily. And in Brussels, it was accepted that these two personalities will alternatively represent France every month. But there was an agreement there. I think if we had been in a situation with Macron and Jordan Bardella, it would have been really difficult, because you would have had, on the one hand, the French president asserting support to Ukraine, maybe putting troops in Ukraine, supporting the accession process inside the European Union, and then a prime minister who would have said that he's totally against it, and using a rhetoric that Viktor Orban is using right now, which is that they are the party of peace when the governing powers right now are the parties of war. And so it would have been totally incomprehensible. I think what we're seeing now, most likely, depending on the coalition, but I feel there is going to be a lot of continuity. Most of them are pro-European. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is not, and we can get to that a bit later on. But the other parties, the Greens, the Socialists, the mainstream right, they're fairly pro-European, in favor of more strategic autonomy, more European sovereignty. They would have continued to push for that. And they might do it a bit differently, both in substance but also in the implementation than Macron would have. But they would be fairly convergent. And actually, I would think even in the case of the National Rally coming to power, Macron, my sense is, would have doubled down on foreign policy to say that this is the domaine réservé, the reserved areas for the president to work on foreign and defense policy. This is also an interpretation of the constitution of the Fifth Republic, but an interpretation that is very close to Macron's heart. So I don't think that he would have given up. I think he is less weakened now than he was a few days ago, because now there's a sense that actually things are going to work out. The French parliament is probably going to be more powerful than it has been in a long time. And so these forces will have to be reckoned with, but they will not be totally divergent or diametrically opposed.
Concretely, when you say the French parliament is going to be more powerful for foreign affairs, security policy, defense policy, foreign policy, what are the parliament's powers beyond, I guess, budgetary powers?
So they're mostly budgetary, but again, this is customary. It has been the case that it was mostly in the hand of the president and the diplomatic cell and the administration. We have a lot of French parliamentarians who don't speak any other language than French, who are much less used than their European counterparts to actually visit other European parliaments and their counterparts. I think this can change. There's no reason why it shouldn't. And if it does, then actually that helps build much more solid and structural links between people, because personal is policy. And so you need people inside the system, parliamentarians, people who speak also for the French people, who are visiting these other places, and they can come up with a number of bills in favor of, more activity between France and Germany when it comes to transatlantic relations, more activity between France and Latvia when it comes to defense, or France and Estonia. It could go beyond the president and I think the administration, and I think that would be super helpful. It's not been done until now, but there's actually leeway for it to happen.
Interesting. Okay, so I want to move on to European politics and EU politics, because Something else that happened this week is that Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party joined forces with the camp of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's party to form a powerful new far-right bloc in the EU Parliament. This group is called Patriots for Europe, is going to be led by Jordan Bardella, the 28-year-old protégé of Le Pen. And they're going to have 84 members, so they're going to be the parliament's third largest political group. And this happens at a time when Hungary holds the presidency in Europe. You know, the European elections, the lead up to those elections, there was a real concern that we were going to have a far-right takeover. And I think with the exception of some national political results in France and Germany, largely we have a consensus that the center has held in European politics. But this does sort of throw a spanner in the works of this reading, I think. So how much influence do you think that this new bloc, the Patriots for Europe, is really going to have over EU politics?
So I think it really depends on their capacity to propose bills, to come up with solutions, and to see whether they're capable of doing anything beyond just blocking and stalling inside the European Parliament. What we saw in the previous European elections in 2019 was that they had planned to form a transnational list with Viktor Orban already at the time, and they didn't manage. They agreed on migration issues, but they really struggled to form something that was a bit more concrete. I think what they ambitioned to do this time around was to be part of Giorgia Meloni's ECR, and she actually threw them out or didn't open the door to them, which I think is quite interesting. And so they're going to Viktor Orban now. They're very close on foreign policy. Their proximity to Russia is something that really binds them together, the willingness to do more on migration, but also the willingness to undermine the EU from the inside. I think we saw that leaving the EU is not their main policy proposition anymore. Brexit's really served as a cautionary tale there. But they do want to use European funds to undermine the EU from the inside. They actually want to weaponize Europe, to weaken it. And I think by doing nothing, they can do that. I would be even more worried if actually they got their act together and decided to transform the EU from the inside with policy propositions, because I think this is where it could get scary. And this is where possibly they could also ally with Giorgia Meloni's group, because they are separate for now, and you're right that they're the third group. But if we bring these two hard right groups together, they're actually stronger than the European People's Party, which is the first party right now. So I totally agree the center held, and we're seeing a division of the hard right, the far right now inside the European Parliament. But I fear that there might be some key issues that they're pushing, and typically the migration issue, on which they might find some agreement. And their capacity to really break the EU from the inside, I think, is something that we need to be very wary of. It's a big policy proposition from their side, and we've heard this quite a few times already, but autocrats or wannabe autocrats tend to say what they're going to do. They announce it. They're not scared of it. And so we need to take them to their words.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right to say that they can do damage by doing nothing, if you will, by stalling and vetoing. They can do even more damage by actually proposing policy issues and setting the debate, which is a real power they have in the parliament now. And so far, I have to say, Viktor Orban in particular is very well organized, very concrete in his proposals that he puts on the stage right now. So one to watch for sure. So even if Marine Le Pen's party maybe didn't get what they wanted in the second round of voting at a national level, at a European level, they're making moves. Okay, I want to briefly talk about NATO. You've mentioned it already. It's on everybody's minds right now because the summit is taking place in DC as we speak. What do you think France's election results mean for France's role in NATO in the coming years? And I think I just want to prompt you to talk a little bit about how these fringe positions, I'm not sure we can call them fringe anymore, but the far-right position, obviously quite Putin-friendly, Russian-friendly on NATO, and the far-left position, quite unfriendly towards the US and also NATO, how they might influence political discourse in France, if at all.
So there is certainly space for them to influence it, because mostly people in France don't really know what NATO does. I think there's knowledge around NATO that it's much, much lower than in other member states. There's knowledge about the EU, which is much lower. And so what we see in France is what we call the soft Euroscepticism, which is that people agree with the idea of Europe, but they really struggle with accepting how European institutions work, which I think sounds always very strange to colleagues from other European member states because France is a founding member and an actor in Brussels, which is considered quite key, as you said yourself, an agenda setter on a number of issues. And really the same goes, and I would say it's even worse for NATO. I think many French people don't know that we're part of NATO. They don't know what NATO does. It's rarely taught at school. I mean, it's taught in history classes, but it feels very disconnected from the daily lives of people. And this is, again, a responsibility, I think, for policymakers to make it more relevant.
But it was enough to keep these parties from allying, right?
It did, absolutely. And it was, I would say, mostly on the EU and European foreign policy. But I think the sense that there are a lot of people on the far left who are anti-American and hence pro-Russia. I think the connection between the two, or vice versa, pro-Russia and hence anti-American, is something that I have to say feels a bit disconnected from today's world. There's a lot of work for us to do in trying to explain what NATO does. France is also not part of all the institutions inside NATO, and there is still very much a call for France's independence when it comes to setting up foreign and security policy. But even inside the system, I think there are people who value this. And I have to say, since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, there's been a greater sense of acknowledgement in France of what alliances are for, both the EU and NATO, and how you protect a continent. And you don't do that just nationally by yourself, but you do that by working with partners.
Okay, so very optimistic, positive spin on this issue. Those parties in the center who are committed to Europe and the transatlantic relationship will have to work harder and see this as a wake-up call, a call to arms to make the case for these institutions domestically. Tara, this has been a fantastic conversation. I usually end this show by asking my guest for a recommendation for a book or a paper that is relevant to our discussion. Feel free to recommend your own work or anybody else's. Do you have anything for us?
So I have two that are not directly relevant to this, but I think that have marked my passage in the US for the past 18 months. One is a book by Isabel Wilkerson called The Warmth of Other Suns, which narrates the story of the Great Migration of Black Americans from the South to the North between the 1920s and 1970s. And I think it says a lot about today's social tissue and politics inside America. So that was really enlightening to me. And the second pertains to this a little bit because we haven't pronounced the C word in this foreign policy discussion, which is the China discussion, which is really prominent in the US. And as a European living in DC, we are being told all the time that China is the pacing challenge. And there have been a series of articles inside the Foreign Affairs magazine presenting a variety of view of what America thinks about China. And I think that is really, really helpful, especially at a time in Europe where we tend to think that China is a bipartisan issue. It's considered in the same way on both sides of the aisle. And I do think these series of articles actually demonstrate that there are a variety of views in DC on China, and Europeans need to read about them and to learn about them for us to be able to set our own China policy.
Excellent. Tara, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, Mira Varghese produces the show, and Clarissa Guerrero is our executive producer. I'm Sophia Besch. Thanks for listening.